Hello folks, this is a follow-up to my first Nickelodeon Exposures video. I made this back in April in honor of Nickelodeon's 45th anniversary. But ever since I uploaded that video, I've received a couple of complaints. Mainly that I missed a lot of shows, but that wasn't really the whole point of the video. It was about my first introductions to all of the Nick shows that I remember being introduced to. I wasn't naming every single Nick show. I even mentioned this in the video. But that's not really important to today's subject. What is important are the shows people asked about. That's right, folks. I'm gonna talk about syndicated shows and why they weren't in the Exposures video. But before we do that, I must address a few things. First off, I'm just gonna tell you my reason right off the bat, just for the people who don't want to sit around and listen to the details. I didn't want to confuse any of my international viewers who might have grown up with these shows on different networks. If you don't understand that, or if you were planning to watch this video in its entirety anyway, then keep watching. Next, I'm very well aware that some of the shows that I'm about to mention might have appeared on Nick internationally as well, but I'm not going to be focusing on that since it doesn't change the fact that these shows weren't made for Nickelodeon. Next, I am not a historian, and there are certain things that I couldn't figure out in this video, so take some of the stuff I say with a grain of salt. Finally, and most importantly, this video is not meant to change anybody's minds. There's a reason why a lot of people call these Nick shows, which I'll talk about a little later in the video. I'm just trying to add context to my situation. With all of that out of the way, let's get started. First off, what is syndication? I know nobody's asking this question, but whatever. Syndication is when a program owned by a specific network or company is licensed to another network for reruns or international airings. Some of you may call this acquired programming. And let me start out by saying Nickelodeon has always had syndicated shows. In fact, 80s Nickelodeon was largely made up of acquired programming, with shows like Danger Mouse and The Elephant Show. Syndication definitely helped Nickelodeon in its early days, especially when you consider that all of their original shows weren't necessarily intended for them. Their first show, Pinwheel, was created for Cube, the precursor to Nickelodeon. Other shows like Hocus Focus and Livewire weren't created with Nickelodeon in mind, but they just sort of ended up on there. And You Can't Do That on Television was technically a syndicated show, despite Nickelodeon having some involvement in the later seasons. For those of you who have seen my Exposures video, you might remember that I included this show. I did have my reasons, and I will be recapping some of the other potential rule breakers I included at the end of this video, so stay tuned. But yeah, Nickelodeon was mostly syndication back then. They didn't start making shows specifically for them until 1986 with Double Dare. I don't feel the need to go over the syndicated shows of the 80s since they're either forgotten or they're not commonly referred to as Nick shows by fans anymore. It was the 90s where our journey begins. Now, how does one know whether or not a show is syndicated or owned? Well, the best way to determine that is the show's copyright at the end of the credits. For example, while Rugrats is copyrighted by Viacom, Little Bear is copyrighted by Nelvana. Another good way to tell is with Nickelodeon merchandise, specifically crossover merch with both Nicktoons and Nick Jr. characters. Typically, syndicated shows are not represented here. Sometimes there are exceptions, but more on those later. Also, I'm very well aware that some of these shows appeared in Nickelodeon ads, but that's not really a sign of ownership. This is something that the owners have to allow to get people to watch the shows on Nickelodeon. And finally, and this is not really the best method, but it's worth noting, most shows based on books are syndicated. Maisie Mouse, Olivia the Pig, Max and Ruby, you get the idea. This isn't always the case, however. Little Bill, for instance, became property of Nick. I've heard similar talk about Big Nate, but as of this video, I'm not necessarily sure. As a matter of fact, that was the reason why I didn't talk about it in the Exposures video. Now that I've got that out of the way, I want to break some of these shows up into specific categories. I'm sure most Fairly OddParents fans know about Nelvana, as they hold the international distribution rights to the show. I briefly mentioned in the main video that despite this, the Fairly OddParents was still a Viacom-owned show. The funny thing is, a decent handful of shows that were syndicated to Nick were owned by Nelvana. However, most of the Nelvana shows like Maggie and the Ferocious Beast, Franklin, Pelswick, and Wayside are no longer associated with Nickelodeon. It is worth mentioning that Pelswick and Wayside were passed up as Nicktoons during their run on Nick. Pelswick in particular received a white background ID bumper. I have no clue how this happened. The two shows I want to specifically highlight in this category are Little Bear and Max and Ruby. To my knowledge, these shows are no longer rerunning on Nick, but they're still affiliated with Nick to some degree. Both of the shows can be found on Paramount Plus at the time of this video, sporting the Nick Jr. logo. And I've heard through the grapevine that the Nick Jr. and Nick Rewind social media pages sometimes mention them. I know some are going to argue merchandise and flash games are an important factor here, but truth be told, I don't exactly know how that works, so it's best not to think about it. But at the end of the day, these are still not owned by Nickelodeon. It's nice to see that they're still associated with Nick to some degree, but who knows how much longer this is going to last. Also, I'm very well aware that Max and Ruby has jumped between copyright owners over the years, but I felt like putting it here for the sake of convenience. I've already mentioned some of the Nelvana shows like Franklin and Maggie and the Ferocious Beast, and these shows are exactly what they sound like. Shows that were syndicated, but not owned. Shows like Maisie Mouse, Olivia, Kipper, Bob the Builder, etc. Some of these shows like Kipper and Bob, for instance, were only with Nickelodeon for a couple of years. One slight outlier in this group is Peppa Pig. The show is primarily a syndicated show, but for whatever the reason, Peppa has shown up in various Paramount Plus ads, and for the life of me, I can't figure out how or why. But yeah, there's not really much to say about this category. The next category, though, is a bit of a strange case. For those of you who have seen my first Nickelodeon Exposures video, you may remember that I counted noggin shows like Oobi. I mentioned that Oobi was one of the noggin shows that Nickelodeon had the most involvement with, while Sesame Workshop, who helped create Noggin, had little involvement. Well, on the contrary, Play With Me Sesame was a noggin show that Sesame Workshop had the most involvement with. That should come as no surprise since it was Sesame Street related. This show was a weird case because it wasn't syndicated. It was made specifically for Noggin, which I'm sure many of you know already was Nickelodeon's former sister channel. Regardless, I decided to include it in this video only because it's no longer affiliated with Nickelodeon. In fact, Nickelodeon had very little involvement with the show. To my knowledge, their only contribution to the show were creating backgrounds and providing animations, like the show's intro and Bert's computer games. Come to think of it, I'm not even sure if Nickelodeon had any kind of ownership to the show in the first place. I think since it involves a Sesame Workshop-owned property, it ultimately ruled it out as their show. In fact, after its initial run on Noggin, reruns started popping up on PBS Kids Sprout in the US. I've heard through the grapevine that Viacom tried copyrighting the show at some point, but that ultimately didn't work out in their favor. It might be a bit shaky to include this in the video, but I think it makes a nice segue into our next category. Now, this is a topic that is slightly relevant to the subject of this video, but given that most of these shows are no longer associated with Nick, I think it's worth mentioning. These are shows that are copyrighted by their creators. They syndicate them to a network, and as long as they're in active production, the network can do whatever they want with them. This is what I like to call temporary ownership. The major shows in question are Lazy Town and Yo Gabba Gabba. During both of their runs on Nickelodeon, they were heavily associated with not just the network, but the company as well. They even appeared in various Nickelodeon shows and merchandise. The issue is, once the show ends and the network stops showing reruns, they lose the rights to the show. That's why reruns of Lazy Town started popping up on PBS Kids Sprout, and why the new Yo Gabba Gabba show is not affiliated with Nick. In fact, it was for these reasons why I didn't talk about Paw Patrol in the main video. I knew something was up with it, given the fact that Nickelodeon sometimes didn't mention it in their history, but yet I was seeing the characters in Nickelodeon merchandise. I've even seen a handful of Paw Patrol merchandise with Nickelodeon's name on it. I've also heard through the grapevine that the Wubulous World of Dr. Seuss was also one of these shows, though I'm not entirely sure on that, as the historian I heard this from later went on to say that Nickelodeon owned it, which they obviously don't anymore. Then again, Nickelodeon did feature the characters in the 1996 Kids' Choice Awards and promotional material for Blue's birthday special, so maybe it was temporary ownership. But then again, I'm not sure. It's still worth mentioning regardless. I myself was born after the Wubulous World of Dr. Seuss had ended its run on Nick. I did grow up with one of the DVDs, which were released after the rights went back to the Jim Henson Company. Bottom line, these shows were unofficial Nickelodeon shows with a time bomb attached, and once that bomb went off, it was all over for Nickelodeon.
Jerry! There's a bomb strapped to my chest!
When I decided to exclude syndicated shows from my exposures video, I knew I was going to get complaints about the lack of one show, and that show was Wow Wow Wubbzy. This is the one syndicated show that everyone seems to think Nickelodeon owns. Well, I did my research and I can't find any good evidence that supports it being temporarily owned. For instance, during the time that Wubbzy was associated with Nick, there was the Nick Jr. Mega Music Fest. There were no syndicated shows a part of this, including Wubbzy, but you know what show was a part of it? Yo Gabba Gabba. I feel like if Wubbzy was in the former category, he probably would have been there, but that wasn't the case. Sure, there were DVDs with Nick Jr.'s name on it, but the same thing has happened with Little Bear and Max and Ruby. I don't really have much else to say about this one. Wow Wow Wubbzy was a syndicated show. Nothing more than that. I guess I only put it in its own category since it was the one show that I got the most complaints about. Those are all the main categories I wanted to talk about, but I want to briefly touch on some weird enigmas that relate to shows that had reruns on Nick at some point in time. It's only somewhat relevant to the subject, but I decided to talk about them just in case somebody brought them up. In the early 2000s, Nickelodeon got permission to air reruns of Animaniacs. Around the same time, they started a behind-the-scenes segment during commercials. The intro and outro for these are reminiscent of an old film countdown, but instead of numbers, they had Nickelodeon characters. For whatever the reason, Yakko, Wacko, and Dot were a part of the outro. Pinky and the Brain also showed up as well. I'm not sure if there was any kind of legal action, but if there was, it probably wasn't anything major. On a side note, one of the segments was included on 2 Jimmy Neutron DVDs, Confusion Fusion and the complete series from Shout Factory. The other enigma was something I briefly touched on in my main video. When I talked about Global Guts, I mentioned a Nickelodeon board game called Nickelodeon Trivia. I went on to mention that for whatever the reason, it featured questions about a Where's Waldo cartoon, which did not originate with Nick. I found a couple of wiki articles that claimed that the show had reruns on Nick at some point, but I couldn't find any specific dates. Also, there's a great website out there called Nick and More, which has a huge list of every single show that has ever appeared on Nickelodeon. Syndicated, owned, reruns, they had everything. And oddly enough, this Where's Waldo show wasn't on it. It's also worth mentioning that in the US, the show was originally syndicated to CBS, and Nickelodeon would eventually partner with them to form Nick on CBS. However, I also couldn't find any dates on how long Where's Waldo reran on CBS, so I'm left with baseless speculation. If anyone has any ideas why this show appeared in that board game, please let me know. On a similar note, I was told by a friend that Max and Ruby were mentioned in the Nickelodeon edition of Trivial Pursuit. I'm not sure if any other syndicated shows were mentioned, given the fact that I don't own the game, but at least it makes more sense than Where's Waldo. So now I must ask the question, why don't I like talking about these shows when talking about Nickelodeon? Well, ownership is the main thing, but you probably already knew that. But it's also because of my international viewers. I know there's plenty of people who grew up with these shows on Nick. When you see a show on a certain network, you either assume that it's property of that network, or you get so used to seeing it on that network that it becomes an honorary addition to you. I'm not gonna lie, I was once one of those people. But many people outside of the US didn't grow up with these shows on Nickelodeon, especially if the show in question wasn't made in America. I'm sure there's plenty of kids who grew up watching Bob the Builder on BBC and not Nick Jr. In fact, that sometimes applies to American kids as well. I myself didn't grow up with Kipper and Bob the Builder on Nickelodeon. I grew up with them on VHS tapes, and by the time I did see them on television, they had jumped ship to PBS Kids and PBS Kids Sprout. In fact, during the making of this video, I found out that the Rubber Dubbers was also with Nickelodeon for a short time. This was yet another show I grew up with on VHS, but by the time I saw it on TV, it was with PBS Kids. Another reason relates to spin-offs. Going back to Bob the Builder, the show's original run was syndicated to Nickelodeon in the US, but Project Build It and the 2015 Bob the Builder never touched Nickelodeon. If I refer to Bob the Builder as a Nickelodeon show, and someone who's more familiar with the 2015 Bob heard it, they'd probably be really confused. I'm not saying that's likely to happen, I'm just giving an example. But again, I must reiterate, for a lot of people, these were Nickelodeon shows. They had Nickelodeon to thank for getting syndication for these shows. The memories we all had with these shows are very valuable, and no one can take that away from us. I myself had quite the nostalgia overload when making this video. A lot of these shows I completely forgot about, and it was really nice to go back through memory lane and check out some of them again. For most of these shows, Nickelodeon was my first exposure to them. So although they didn't make them, I still have to thank them. That pretty much concludes the main subject of this video. There are some other subjects relating to the main exposures video that I'd like to discuss, but before we do that, I'd like to share a personal memory of what made me aware of what syndication was. And it all stems from good old Max and Ruby. As a kid, I grew up with the TV show. Max and Ruby started out as storybooks, but I didn't grow up with those, so I assumed that Nickelodeon owned these characters. Fast forward to when I was in kindergarten and my teacher started reading us the Max and Ruby books. She read books like Bunny Money, Bunny Mail, and Max's Chocolate Chicken. She also showed us a Max and Ruby VHS tape that contained episodes from the show that I was familiar with, so that kind of buried the lines a bit and kept me from thinking about it. But then many years later, in I'd want to say 2012, me and my family were babysitting one of my cousins for the weekend, and they had brought over a Max and Ruby DVD, which we put on at night. The thing was, though, it was not a DVD for the TV show. It was a DVD, a part of something called Scholastic Storybook Treasures, and the cartoons on it were significantly different from what I was familiar with. I'm sure most of you are just learning about these for the first time, so let me introduce you to the Weston Woods Max and Ruby cartoons, produced in 1988 and 1991. When I first saw these, I was at a complete loss. They were Max and Ruby, but they weren't the Max and Ruby I was familiar with. It was interesting, but something wasn't sitting right with me. It was almost like the DVD was yelling at me. Then and there, I remembered the Max and Ruby books from kindergarten, and at that very moment, the writing on the floor was clear.
You have been cheated and lied to!
I knew it.
I took to the internet, and it was there where I found out about the origins of Max and Ruby, and that the show that I was familiar with wasn't specifically made for Nickelodeon. And that's what did it. After that, other shows would follow suit. I found a Little Bear book at my local library, and I saw an Olivia book at a local pharmacy. I know it sounds absolutely stupid that all of this stems from two obscure cartoons, but that's just the kind of person I am. I am not normal, somebody call a doctor. As I promised, I'm going to be recapping some of the rule breakers that were featured in the main video. Things might get a bit unscripted here, so bear with me. First up are the Paws Inc. properties, Garfield and US Acres. I mentioned in the video that I specifically included them as franchises, not shows, franchises. This was because Nickelodeon has yet to do anything major with the characters outside of merchandise. I've also mentioned that all of the previous Garfield projects were not owned by Nickelodeon. Also, the Garfield movie that came out in May was not Nickelodeon, that was Sony. In fact, that film was in production before Nickelodeon's acquisition of Paws Inc. Given the fact that Sony has teased the sequel, I think it's safe to say that Garfield is the Spider-Man of Nickelodeon. Next up was You Can't Do That on Television. I mentioned that this was technically a syndicated show, but Nickelodeon eventually had more involvement with it as the show went on. In the main exposures video, I also mentioned that the creator of this show claimed that Nickelodeon didn't own it. However, given that so much of this show was basically what Nickelodeon would become, it felt wrong not to include it. After all, it was the first Nick show with slime. Next were the 1987 and 2003 Ninja Turtles shows. These obviously were not made for Nickelodeon, but they were eventually acquired by Nick. The 2003 series in 2009 and the 1987 series in 2023. Therefore, I gave them a pass in since they're owned by Nickelodeon. I still can't help but feel that Doug is somewhat of a rule breaker, given the fact that Disney owns the franchise still, but I knew that if I didn't include Doug, many people would have gotten mad. For many people, Doug's core identity still remains with Nickelodeon. Not only that, but the original series is still exclusively owned by them. I called Little Bill a rule breaker, but I think that wasn't really because it was not owned by Nickelodeon, but because of the whole Bill Cosby thing. It's a Nick-owned show, but I felt like I was breaking some sort of rule by talking about it. The Upside Down show is one that I wasn't sure about. I mentioned in the video that I didn't know who owned the Upside Down show, and truth be told, I still don't know. I gave it a pass just because of how much I love the show. The copyright says it's copyright of Noggin and Sesame Workshop, so we could be looking at a Roger Rabbit scenario. But again, I have no clue. This is just baseless speculation. Making Fiends was technically a rule breaker, and I have the internet to blame for that. It started out as a web series, but then it got picked up for a Nickelodeon show, and then once that ended, I think they lost the rights. I'm not sure. It's worth mentioning that the credits do say that it's copyright of Viacom, so we could be looking at a Doug situation here. If that is the case and Nickelodeon owns exclusive rights to the TV show, then I guess I feel less guilty about including it. Even if I had known this, I probably would have included it anyway, since most people know Making Fiends for the TV show. Glitch Tex might have been a rule breaker. I only think that because it was a Netflix show. Finally, the SpongeBob puppet shows. These were kinda rule breakers since they were YouTube shows and not TV shows, but given the fact that SpongeBob As Told By was put on Paramount Plus and digital storefronts, I felt like giving it the pass. And the only reason why I counted Pineapple Playhouse was because it was somewhat tied to As Told By. That's why you didn't see SpongeBob Reimagined or SpongeBob in Real Life. I know that Pineapple Playhouse is technically a part of SpongeBob in Real Life, but again, I was already bending the rules with 2 YouTube shows. I didn't want to include any more. As I mentioned before, the whole point of the exposures video was about my first exposures to all of the Nickelodeon shows I remember being exposed to. I will shamefully admit there were some shows that I did know, but I completely forgot about them when making the video. My Brother and Me and True Jackson VP, for instance. Of course, some people missed the whole point of this video and asked why certain shows weren't in it. I got a couple of questions about things that didn't really qualify for the video, so I wanted to bring them up here. First up are series of shorts that didn't receive TV shows. In the video, I was naming shows in a chronological order, and if a show started as a series of shorts, I would put them chronologically when the shorts began. I did this for shows like The Adventures of Pete and Pete and Ubi. However, other series of shorts like Inside Out Boy, Ambi and Dexter, and A Show of Hands I didn't talk about. This is because none of them became TV shows. If I had included them, I probably would have had a lot to say about them, but I decided against it. Next up are movies that didn't receive TV shows. Now, I did briefly mention the Barnyard and Jimmy Neutron movies in the video, but that ultimately didn't matter as I chronologically placed them by show debut, not movie. I know that there's Nickelodeon movies that never received shows, like Rango, but for me it just didn't feel right to include them. Next up is the Kids' Choice Awards. I'm surprised somebody actually complained about this, given the fact that I didn't think anybody actually called this an actual TV show. The reason why I didn't include it is very simple. It's an annual event. Can I really call an annual event a TV show? I don't think so. It's not like you can jump on Paramount Plus and watch every single Kids' Choice Awards ever made. That would be cool, but of course, copyright's an issue. Finally, live stage shows and Broadway musicals. I am very well aware that some of these have been broadcasted, like the SpongeBob musical in honor of SpongeBob's 20th anniversary, and Rugrats A Live Adventure was broadcasted internationally, but again, they're shows, but not TV shows. They weren't made for TV, they were made for stage. It's kinda different. Also, very much like the Kids' Choice Awards, it's not like you can easily find these and watch these. Sure, the SpongeBob musical you can, but Rugrats and Blue's Clues? Yeah, not really. I'm sure Nickelodeon does have some sort of professional recordings of these shows in their archives, but whether or not we'll ever see them get a proper release is unknown. Probably never. Finally, I would like to give a massive apology to the DreamWorks shows. It is to my understanding that these shows are exclusively owned by Nickelodeon, despite not being Nickelodeon properties. But even if I had known that when making the exposures video, I still don't think I would have included them, largely because, well, they're not Nickelodeon properties. They're under the Universal umbrella. As I said before, Doug is technically a Disney property, but the original series is still owned by Viacom, and many people still associate it with Nickelodeon. Madagascar, on the other hand, is firmly a DreamWorks property, and many people associate that with the movies. Given that I put Doug and Making Fiends in the video, I could have bent the rules for these shows, but I probably wouldn't have felt comfortable doing that. And thus, this concludes this follow-up video that nobody asked for. I really hope you enjoyed it regardless, and if you want to check out my first Nickelodeon Exposures video, I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Anyways, have a good night.